Hello, good to see you today. I'm Peter Neufeld and part of the HR team here at Maple Leaf. It's sunny where I am. I'm in Mississauga. I hope you're having a good day. I think after the results of last night and continued uncertainty today, I think all of us can really use some grounding in nature and just get focused. So again, today's session, I'll give you a quick setup in terms of how we run it. We're going to hear from an amazing speaker in a moment, and then what we're going to do is want to hear from you. And so it's really important for this session that we hear your questions. So there's an icon in the top right corner. Just click on that icon at any time, write your questions, and we'll get to them, as many of them as we can. Today's session, I think, is pretty topical and pretty timely, burnout and resilience. And it's one that I think has been on a lot of our minds. We started this series of Healthy Minds speaking at the start of the pandemic, about 3 or 4 weeks in. And here we are now 6, 7 months into the pandemic. And I think our view and our appreciation of these topics has probably been heightened now more than ever. Today we have our guest, Paula Allen. Paula, welcome. It's great to have you join us today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so I've met with Paula a number of times. I've heard her live before, and we've had a number of conversations online. And Paula, the question that I was going to pose to you was, every time I see you, every time I talk with you, you are always so calm and in the moment. And I was going to ask, what's your secret? But I think that's probably embedded in the discussion that we're going to have today. So I'll save that until the end of our talk, and look forward to hearing your presentation today and interacting with you more. So welcome, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll give you half of the answer to that question. I have a great advantage in the role that I have in getting information. So I have a lot of information around mental health. I have a lot of information around well-being. That's one of the things that really excites me about the role that I have. And when you have information, you can use it in a pretty positive way. So I'm hoping to share some of that information with everybody who's on this call right now, and hoping that it'll benefit everyone as well. So if we move to the next point, I really want to make sure that we start with a bit of grounding in terms of where we are right now as a society, where we are right now as people, because I don't need to tell anybody on the call that this is not normal. This is not the business as usual. But what I do fear is that we're in some ways getting used to it. I hear people talking about, well, of course, we're frustrated. Of course, there's mental health issues, and almost making it like an of course, like we should accept it. And that's pretty dangerous. That's extremely dangerous, actually, because even though everybody is in the same boat, really the call to action is to make sure that we do something about it, that we don't accept going down a river that's negative in terms of our mental health. And that will happen if we're not active about it. So when we think about what the pandemic has brought into our lives, it's brought a massive amount of change. And you probably have heard at some point in your life that change is stressful, even positive change. So with all the changes that we've had, work, relationships, how you spend your time, and most of us would think that that's not positive. That's a real burden on our minds. The other thing is uncertainty and a sense that we're losing, control over the things that we had control over before. Our patterns are different, so we're feeling a little bit, in most cases, more isolated. And we know that, having social support is a big part of keeping mentally healthy. So if you look at all the things that have been caused by the pandemic, these are all the exact things that put us most at risk as human beings in terms of our mental well-being, and not in a small way either, significantly. And when you have so much change and so much uncertainty, we tend to go through a pretty predictable cycle, like shock, denial, confusion. I know certainly that I had that in the very beginning, where what's going on? Is this really real? And then we feel a little bit of anger, a little bit of frustration, a little bit of anxiety. And that's normal. It's not fun. So to feel these responses isn't bad. What you have to pay attention to, though, is when they start to take you over, when they start to become part of your personality, when people ask if things are okay, or you're feeling more off than on. So that is really the risk when we're not dealing with or processing these emotions and getting to the next point, which is our adjustment that predicts whether we're going to have a good long-term adjustment. So if we move to the next slide, just to give you a sense in terms of the scope of the impact, we ask people, is the pandemic negatively impacting your mental health? And actually 80% of Canadians, working Canadians, were aware that it was. Now, this is pretty much unprecedented. There's virtually nothing else in my professional career that I've seen that has impacted as much of the population as this. And these are people who were aware that it's impacting their mental health. There's many people who aren't necessarily. So when you think about it, we're dealing with something now that is an issue literally of 4 in 5, not 1 in 5 anymore. The risk curve has moved. All of us have greater risk. And for some, we've already seen negative consequences. We've seen, extreme calls to the EAP. We've seen all sorts of things. For others, there'll be negative consequences later on. And for others, we'll be just fine. We'll get through it. But why would we roll the dice on that? Why would we roll the dice on whether the risk that we're experiencing is going to be okay or not okay? You want to make sure that you're loading the dice, you've got the thumb on the scale in the positive sense. And on top of that, even if things are okay, why would you want to go through unnecessary distress? So that's a lot of what we're talking about right now, how to recognize these points of distress and what to do to make sure that you can get through this in the best way possible. If we move to the next slide, just wanted to share a couple of points around how it is that we experience issues around our mental health. And sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's, more aches and pains. Sometimes it's just being a little bit more short. Another way is actually what you see here on the screen, and we're seeing a good portion of working Canadians actually feeling less motivated at work than before, finding it harder to concentrate, being more exhausted at the end of the day. It could be that your productivity is exactly the way it was before, but perhaps it's because you're working more hours. Is it more difficult to do what you did before now than it was? So these are all red flags, and all of these things are actually symptoms of burnout, that kind of emotional exhaustion that people feel when there's so much on your mind that everything that you do feels harder. So if we move to the next point, just a little bit of dispelling some myths about burnout, because this term kind of came up a number of years ago and is often associated with workaholism, like the workaholic who puts in everything, whose work is their entire life, and of course they reach a point where they can't handle it any longer because the human body needs respite. It's not as simple as that. If you're feeling, if you have that additional strain, emotional strain from any source, it could be parenting, elderly caregiving, compassion fatigue, or just plain worry and anxiety, you can feel that emotional strain, and then you can feel that sense of burnout. And the way we understand it is that you feel that emotional exhaustion that we talked about before. You also start feeling less motivation, as we're seeing is happening in almost 4 in 10 Canadians. You stop caring quite as much. You feel badly about the work that you're doing because you feel less accomplished, because it's not that you're not a motivated person. It's because you just don't have the energy to be motivated, and that's a conflict. So it's not a good place to be. Many of us, because of the emotional drain that we have as a result of the pandemic, are trending that way. But the good news is it doesn't have to continue on. Again, I mentioned to Peter, one of the things that is great about the career that I have is that I have a lot of information, and I can tell you there are a lot of things that you can do to make sure that even if you have risk, it is not your destiny. So if we move to the next point, a little bit about some of the factors, because you can make this as complicated as you want to make it, but at its core, there's two things that really put us at risk of burnout. One is the excessive mental strain that I'd spoken to you about. So a lot of change, worry and anxiety. What we're finding as well is a lot of the anxiety that people are feeling is around financial uncertainty. So we'll talk a little bit about how to take control in that respect. A lot of anxiety that people are feeling is with respect to children. We're finding that parents actually are feeling much more drained and have been impacted a great deal more than non-parents as a result of the pandemic, because you're dealing with the issues of your child, routines of your child. And as my mother always said, when you have a child, your joy is increased, but your worry is increased as well. So all of that excessive strain is unfortunately something that many of us are dealing with right now. But the other thing that makes this even a more difficult situation right now is that we as human beings can deal with a fair bit of strain. We have a fair bit of resilience just built in with us, but it doesn't just happen. We need recovery support. We need social support. We need things that happen in our life that help give us back our energy. And because of the changes that we've had in our routines as a result of the pandemic, much of that just isn't happening naturally. So moving on, just a little bit more around those points in the next slide. I think the first thing to remember is just having rest doesn't give you that balance. So if you work and sleep, if you worry and sleep, that's not enough, right? Recovery isn't passive. You have to do things that take you in a different place in your mind, because when you have strain, your mind kind of habituates to that strain, and you need something to take you in another direction. You need fun, you need exercise, you need other things to take you out of that path, and that's the balance that's important. So not just about rest, it is about being active in your actions, your thought, and in your social interactions as well. If you move to the next point, just a little bit about the excessive mental strain. The other thing is, when we're talking about resilience, some people name themselves or name others as resilient because those people or yourself just push through. There's a stoicism, there's a strength, there's a, I will just get through it no matter what. That's not resilience, right? Resilience isn't about pushing through the strain, because sometimes that can cause some damage. The resilience is the ability to manage and recover from that strain. So with all the things that are going on around us, how do we put that into context? How do we bring back that sense of control that we've lost? How do we make sure that we get what we need as human beings? So moving on, some more about that. So if you're thinking about getting back balance, if you're thinking about taking back control, there's a few things that we need to do every single day that gives us what we need to have on a psychological point of view. We need a sense of accomplishment. And many of us get that from work, but some of us have also been used to getting that from outside work, like your dance lessons, your volunteer work. Somehow you need to replace anything that you might have lost, doing things in a different way. Supportive social contact as well. So not just being with other people, but being with people that you trust, that you can be open with, that you support, because actually giving support means that you'll probably get a fair bit back in terms of your own self-satisfaction, but also from the other person. Fun and laughter, physical movement. Think about how you spend your hours in the day. If you don't have time and significant time for each one of those things, you're out of balance. You're increasing your risk. The other thing is that point of taking control. And I mentioned finances before because in our research, what we're finding again is this financial uncertainty is a big driver for this pandemic strain that we have. And we have found that people who do take stock of their finances, understand them, because many of us don't, understand your finances, build contingencies, increase your savings, because again, many of us have been remiss in that area. When we find that people actually take those actions, their mental health and their outlook improves. So these are certain practical things that can move us forward. Being realistic about what you can and can't accomplish. Nobody is superhuman, and also paying attention to what triggers your stress and making sure that you never get to that point where you feel overwhelmed, that you reach out for support from a friend, a colleague, a family member first, and definitely a professional if you feel this recurring or overwhelming you in any way, shape, or form. So moving to the next point, on the next slide, the other piece is to really pay attention to what's happening to you and to leverage the skills that you probably already have. So changes in your behavior, really paying attention to temporary coping strategies, which unfortunately have increased in our society. So since the pandemic, the level of risky drinking has increased. Other things like gambling for distraction, anything that kind of gives us that distraction but doesn't solve a problem or give us a sense of control is a huge red flag. And believe me, your body and your mind won't forgive you just because it's the pandemic. The impact is going to still be the same. And as I said, that feeling of being overwhelmed, this is where you really need to reach out for professional help, EAP, any kind of help that is available to you. And also think about what's in your mind. How, are you over catastrophizing? Are you over generalizing? One of the things that we have found is those people who actually focus on feeling a sense of gratitude, that helps them through. You're taking stock in a realistic way, and that gives us strength and power. Meditation and mindfulness also go very well with that. And I cannot underestimate the value of social support. Stress as human beings is something that we all feel, but the way that human beings manage stress, the most, just like almost the way you manage hunger is with food, the support of others. So moving to the next and last points. So overall, I've given you hopefully things that are helpful in addressing specifically burnout, but there are some things that I just want you to be aware of, because again, the more knowledge we have, the more power we have if you act on that knowledge. And these 5 things are basically risk factors for mental health issues, pandemic or no pandemic. And if you understand those risks, then you can take action to counter them. So a few things, biological risks, like, mental health is basically relates to your brain. Your brain is part of your body. There's many things that actually increase or decrease your risk. So one is genetics. If you have mental disorders in your family, doesn't necessarily mean that you will, but you have to be more vigilant in your self-care. The nutrition that you have, is it balanced? Are you feeding your brain properly? If you've had a brain injury, taking care of it, very, very aggressively and following rules, because we know things like concussions put us in a more high risk situation. All of these things are important. Paying attention to the type of stress as well. If you've had any major losses, if you have things that are traumatic in your life, if your stress is unrelenting or disempowering, if you really feel that sense of being overwhelmed, that's a definite risk. And many of us think of traumatic stress only as loss of life or being in a war. No. It's something that is so dramatic in our life that we feel that we have lost our sense of power. We feel that it might be cruel. We feel that it is just something that we can't handle. And that always requires professional support. Sleep Absolutely, because that's our recovery process. So managing blue light, routines, calming your mind, and as I said before, relationships, and not just quantity of relationships, the quality as well. And finally, thinking style. So I mentioned not over catastrophizing, not over generalizing, and we can learn skills that will be very helpful. There's cognitive behavioral therapy is really just about assessing what's in front of you and learning a way to understand and deal with it that's productive. Now, many people use that for extreme anxiety or depression or things that are clinical, but I can tell you that that kind of therapy is good just as a skill building exercise for all of us. So went through a fair bit in a fairly short period of time, but really want to hear from you right now. Any questions, any comments? Love to continue the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. So folks, again, a reminder, if you have a question, just click on the icon and I'll be monitoring them. I think, though, to start, it's interesting, Paula, because you were saying at the beginning that as a researcher, you have access to so much information. And, I know that the big thing, though, is a huge difference between knowing and applying. And so, it must speak to the ability to choose how to apply some. Do you have any advice in terms of, we're getting a lot of ideas about what we can do, but how to actually move it from here to inside and how we act?
That's a great question, and something certainly that researchers struggle with as well. But I think at the end of the day, you have to make up your mind to do something, and not overthink it. I think a lot of us overthink things. We might feel a little bit off, but we don't actually take the action to do anything about it. We start thinking about how bad does it have to be before I reach out for support. If you're talking about, your life structure or your life routine is maybe a little bit less healthy than it was before, you can put it off until later on. I think one of the points of information I have that maybe, and several like me have that maybe not everyone has, is that we've seen the consequences of that delay. It's not pretty, and it's not necessary. So I've seen people who have needed to go on disability leave as a result of mental health issues. It's not a pleasant situation. It's not, a place where you feel a sense of control, and understanding those triggers and those points where there could have been a different action taken or a different decision made that could have changed the course of that person's life is highly motivating for me not to follow in those footsteps myself. And also, very importantly, not to ignore people around me, because it is hard. I'm saying it like you should do it like that, but it is hard. When you're feeling depleted, when you're feeling tired, taking action. And this is where we have to take care of each other as well. So if you see a behavior change, if you see something that's off in your neighbor, in your child, in your friend, in your spouse, in your coworker, in your manager, say something, and take that person's hand and let them know that you care about them and encourage them to take a positive step. I think, mental health is a bit of a collective responsibility.
It's totally resonating, and there's a comment here that someone did as a shout out. I want to stress the value of our personal social network and sharing openly with others. When we trust, when feeling overwhelmed or having difficulty, and they're just saying the difference that it makes. A question here is, how do we know when to stop ourselves from overworking? How do we know that when we've kind of caught that threshold where it is too much versus just, the ebbs and flows of work?
Well, it's very interesting how often people start by answering their own questions. So the point around ebbs and flows is huge, because we all have had situations, and we always will have situations where we have to do a bit of a sprint. You have to get a deadline out. You have to, there's a period of time where you might work more than what is healthy on a sustainable basis. And that's not a terrible thing. That's not a bad thing. The important thing is it can't be constant. Like you can't have a life where you're constantly sprinting. You can't not have that downtime where you're able to take care of yourself. Your norm and your baseline should be a life that has some balance to it, that you have work and you have time to sleep, but you also have time for fun. You have time to be creative. You have time for all of those things in your life. So nothing wrong with working hard as long as you have balance. Nothing wrong with sort of putting in those sprints. But if racehorses, for example, sorry for the analogy, they train at 80%. They can't go at 100% because it ends up causing damage. You can't, if you want to build a muscle, you have to build that muscle, but you need rest in order for that muscle to grow. So if you have ebbs and flows, you're probably not in a bad place unless there's more flows than ebbs significantly. If you don't have ebbs and flows, then you are for sure at risk. If you don't have balance in your life, you're for sure at risk.
I think it's interesting too how you called out in your presentation to look at your daily routines.
Yeah.
I've seen people where they say, I'm going to work really hard for the next 3 months. It's a big project and I'll rest later. But what I'm really hearing from you now and encouraging is that balance on a more regular basis versus looking at this will be a busy year, next year will be better. There's a question here. Are there any strategies you can suggest for overthinking, especially when the overthinking causes extreme anxiety? And there's been other questions here related to Sunday evenings where the people find it hard to sleep. So I think it's related.
Yeah. So this is where I am a strong proponent of cognitive behavioral therapy strategies. The only thing I really dislike is the fact that we call it therapy, because that sometimes puts people off. Like, this is really skill building more than anything else. We have a tendency, especially if we're perfectionists or we're high achievers or whatever, to overthink things, to ruminate sometimes. And there's ways that can stop. But it tends to be pretty personal. Like, what is the trigger for that rumination? Like, what have you learned in the past and why have you learned it? And having that kind of awareness allows you to think in a different way. And very rarely are we overthinking everything in our lives. So again, building on strategies that we've had before that helps us put things into context and say, this is what I know, this is what I don't know. This is what I can control, and the center of what I'm going to control is my own health. So I think number one is, if you're recognizing that you're overthinking or you're ruminating, you probably need to reach out and get a little bit of coaching to help you deal with it. There's services that are available free in the Ontario government. There's services available through employers, EAP. Doesn't have to be huge. It could be just a one-session consult to get you thinking in another path. And I'm glad that you mentioned that this is an issue, because if you continue to ruminate in a certain direction and don't stop that pattern, then it'll be harder for you to stop it in the future.
So I'd like to just follow up. You mentioned something that you wish it wasn't called cognitive behavioral therapy. What did you say again that you wish it was called?
What it is skill building.
Exactly.
It's self-awareness, it's knowledge of how you respond, it's practicing strategies. So, you have productive responses in your behavior and realistic responses in your emotion. And those are skills that we all need. Like, it is skill building from my point of view. The beauty of that particular skill is that it will help people who are in a very desperate situation get back control and become healthy. But it is also a wonderful way for us who might not be in a desperate place to build the resilience so we don't get there.
So folks, I'd like to build on and continue on that topic in terms of what Paula just mentioned. I think a lot of us in our minds, we just think of therapy means I must have a significant issue. And I love the way that Paula's identified that even just one session can be helpful, and to reframe it as skill building. We have a number of different resources available on our People site, and they're free. So you can get sessions in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy. We offer that through Beacon. We also offer the face-to-face counseling through Inkblot. And then Paula's with Morneau Chappelle, and we have all of the EFAP offerings. So I'd really encourage you, if you feel that you might benefit from a conversation with someone, just give it a try. There's no risk. You can go in, you can try it and see if it works for you. And this might be your opportunity. And Paul, I love, like I say, I think this is the first time we've heard it framed up as skill building rather than therapy. And I think that really can open things up for people to try something the way that we might try a fitness club or try some other activity that will help us to be our best. We have a number of questions today, and unfortunately, we're out of time now. Paula, thank you so much. There's a wealth of information that you gave us. We will be sharing the slides that Paula sent out, so you can reference them again. And thank you for joining today, and I wish you all a great day. Thanks, Paula.
Great. Thank you for coming, and thank you
Bye.
for doing this. Yeah.